Hello and welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Thank you for being here. We really are here to help you transform state politics. We talk a lot about why it is so broken, what we can have here if we fix it, and how you can get involved. Today, we are going to analyze some of this week's news. So we'll be talking about some environmental law, some climate law that happened in California, also in New York. We will be talking about with the major news stories with Trump. We'll be talking about elections in Finland, elections in Chicago, elections in Wisconsin, and that will be today. But before we do, I would love to introduce my amazing co-host, starting with Jonathan.
Name's Jonathan Cohn, he, him, joining from Boston, although I'm currently in the wonderful city of Philadelphia. And I've been kind of active on different electoral and issue campaigns in Massachusetts for coming close to a decade.
And Jordan.
My name's Jordan Berg-Powers. I use he, him, and I have worked in progressive politics for some time in Massachusetts.
And I am Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. Love local politics, also super engaged in state politics. And here we go this week with an analysis of the news. So we are going to start off, of course, the biggest national news, that is Trump's indictment. And before we talk about the indictment, I'm just going to mention, no surprise, his lead over DeSantis has skyrocketed since he got indicted. He had like an 8-point lead before he got indicted, and now he has like a, 20, 30 points. So let's just go crazy. This country is crazy. But anyway, there you go. There's some news. And
or Republicans are bonkers.
Well, there you go.
Republicans, I think let's be specific. Republicans are bonkers.
Yep.
And so this is just my favorite reminder. So for those of you who don't know, Trump is no longer an unindicted co-conspirator. He was an unindicted co-conspirator in the crime that sent his lawyer and former lawyer fixer, to jail, and that our former Speaker of the House, Robert DeLeo, like formerly Trump, was also and is currently an unindicted co-conspirator to a crime, as said by the prosecutors in 2014. So our last Speaker of the House purportedly got his job by trading votes for jobs in the probation office for people in this thing, and the federal prosecutors said that DeLeo was an unindicted co-conspirator. And you can find it online. So it's one of my favorite little jokes. It's been cracking me up all week. So this is your reminder that, like, if you think that Trump should have gone to jail finally, then you also think the last Speaker of the House should have.
Like the other 3 speakers of the House before him.
Right.
Not just him. 4 in a row.
It is systematic.
It is systematic. Or deep problems at the State House. Whew. Well, we managed to get the State House in. Woo! So next, I would love to talk about the new policy California has passed, right? So they previously had passed some legislation on new passenger vehicles, that they had to meet stricter emissions regulations than the federal regulations. And they now, just this week, passed some for trucks. They're trying to move off of diesel. California does have some of the worst smog problems, especially the LA area, of any place in the country. So they really are dealing with this issue. But what I want to comment on that just boggles my mind is that in order to pass either of these pieces of legislation, they had to get a special waiver from the EPA, because normally states are not allowed to pass stricter emissions policies than the federal government. What? They cannot protect people against corporations. They're literally not allowed to by law. That just it drives me crazy, right? I mean, this is our government protecting corporations and the wealthy from democracy. And I'll take your comments.
I guess I would say it's probably comes from a place that makes some sense, which is that you don't want red states sort of undermining the whatever sort of national regulations, right? You need to have some sort of pre-check. But I think in this case, Obviously, what should have been written in is that if you do more than this, right, like then you get a pass, but you can't do less than this, then you need to tell us why, right? That's an easy fix. But I think, right, lobbyists, we know that lobbyists love this sort of protection where you have to check in, because the only people who will notice it are people who get paid every day and day out to notice it. And so if you create a blanket check-in, then you allow for this sort of being able to stop it in places where people can't see it.
Yeah, no, this reminds me of how I always found it strange, even on like to compare this to something on the state level, is with building code issues, where the legislature needed to create kind of a like stronger green building codes for municipalities to opt into, because they weren't really they couldn't legally just do it themselves because of the weird ways in which Massachusetts prevents municipalities from actually doing things in the first place. But it, like, to me, that always just seemed like a fundamentally bizarre structure where our regulatory system should be a floor, not a ceiling.
And I would tie this into Massachusetts Constitution, because
Mhm.
this is, we've talked about this before on the podcast, but this is a place where there are multiple areas of legislation, incredibly important areas of legislation. I'm talking about the relationships between employers and employees, the relationships between landlords and tenants, that cities are barred from making any kind of legislation around those issues by the Constitution of Massachusetts. I mean, literally, cities are barred from protecting their residents from, wealthy people and corporations. And the way I like to put it is actually that, we protect, the Constitution protects the wealthy, the powerful, and corporations from democracy, because every city should be able to, as Jordan mentioned, you shouldn't be able to do anything. You shouldn't be able to say like, oh, maximum wage is $12. But you should be able to set a minimum wage. You should be able to, create wage theft laws. You should be able to have some tenant protections without having to pass a home rule petition and beg the state for permission to do this in your city.
Yeah.
So that is talking about California truck law. So let's move on. Jonathan, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the New York climate law?
Yeah, so one thing that stuck out in the news recently is that in New York State, and I just seen that apparently Kathy Hochul is now backing down from her attempt of weakening a landmark climate law that New York had passed recently. A quick shout out to the article where I recently confirmed that Kathy Hochul's last name is pronounced as such, because her trick is that it rhymes with local. So the more you know. But that's something that has also existed in New York State with regard to a bail reform law that they had passed recently, where there's been a constant discussion and push, especially from Governor Kathy Hochul, to weaken the law that they passed, with like a evidentially unsound belief that the bail reform law is causing a spike in crime. And what this really, when I see stuff like this happening in other states, it kind of reminds me of the importance of following implementation. And as we had discussed in our last episode with regard to the governor's tax proposal, and how in many ways it is undermining the victory from the Fair Share Amendment last year, that it is so important that after we pass laws, we make sure that those laws are actually implemented. We have the same kind of implementation that needs to be kind of guarded and kind of advocated for around the climate legislation that the legislature had passed in previous sessions, that we have that 2050 roadmap setting like a net zero emission goal by 2050, as well as a number of interim goals, and we are not on track to meet it. And targets are great, but you need plans to meet them, and then even kind of all of the different parts of the implementation of that need continued advocacy. The same thing with the continued advocacy for the rollout of the Work and Family Mobility Act that was passed, but that there was a following regulatory process that came after it before the bill will formally take effect. And we see that with voting rights legislation as well, where last year the legislature finally passed legislation to strengthen protections for jail-based voting, because in Massachusetts, incarcerated individuals who don't have a felony conviction still do maintain the right to vote, but that is often more like on paper than in practice. Mm-hmm. And sheriffs are now required to do a lot more to make sure that vote is real. but somebody needs to be watching the sheriffs to make sure that they actually do that. And the same thing, other example that come to mind is the way how Secretary of State Bill Galvin has, and I don't know if he has ever at this point, because I know it was the case for many years, properly implemented the automatic voter registration law that the Massachusetts legislature passed, which had kind of required it to be an opt-out system as opposed to an opt-in system, noting that if you want people to do something, it needs to be opt-out rather than opt-in. And it is such a good that the case in New York about the backlash she faced that did get her to at least back down for now about watering down a law that passed is a good reminder of how much we really need to be kind of hawk-eyed about the legislation that we passed to make sure that the legislators, many of whom may not have even been that gung-ho about the legislation that they ultimately voted for in the first place, actually keep to the promise by making sure it gets implemented.
It is so hard. It's so hard to know when these things are happening because people barely even know when votes, when legislation is passed.
Yeah, I want to follow up with Jonathan on this and just talk about just to follow up with some direct quotes about like what exactly, how hard it is to get the legislature, especially when they don't agree with it. So one of the people who's quote unquote a leader on the environment, but is often an obstacle in the state Senate, Senator Barrett, said when asked about the fact that the 2050, which is our current law, which we currently are not on track to meet, if he feels like we should actually be more aggressive based on the recent IPCC report, which clearly states that our goals are too slow and will result in us all dying needlessly for no good reason from climate change. And should we be more aggressive? And he said that there could risk backlash as perceived if the climate policies are perceived as liberal. And I'm not interested in freaking people out and forcing them to the right. Imagine thinking in Massachusetts that if you were to aggressively go for trying to make us to decarbonize, that all of a sudden this would be the trigger to them being Republicans. Not fixing the fact that it's unaffordable here, or not fixing the fact that people can't afford childcare, or not fixing the fact that they don't have regular jobs, or that they're worried about their care, or that their schools are falling down. Those aren't the things that it might cause people to maybe pick a different party because the party currently isn't addressing any of their lived experiences. The thing that will do it is aggressively creating new jobs by creating a vibrant green economy and having climate change policies. It's just, and he is considered the leader in Massachusetts, like in our state house on climate. Like this is our problem, to Jonathan's point. And so we currently, to be clear, we have missed our 2020 deadline. Baker slow rolled it. He obfuscated it. He was constantly in the way, even while the media copy and pasted his press releases talking about how he took climate seriously. He did everything possible to not take climate change seriously. And so we are missing targets. Recently, they talked to, I think we all agree here that there needs to be a better investment in public transportation. But as we are a car-based society, one of the things that we have agreed a way to get down emissions is EV cars. And there was another report again about how difficult it is to just put in infrastructure for EV cars. I can tell you, as a zoning board member in Worcester, it is too difficult to put up EV charging stations in the cities and in the things. And Worcester has gone out of its way to make it easier than a lot of the other municipalities around the state. So there's just a lot of infrastructure things. I mean, that's without like the obvious problems with being a car-based thing, that also has its own emissions, that cars create emissions, even EV cars, the creation of EV cars are heavily carbon creation. And so there's like lots of problems with like, even that thing is still a problem, right? So I think that we need to be clear that like we really aren't taking it as seriously as we need to. And the people who are supposed to be taking it seriously are constantly slow walking it or being in the way of it or obfuscating it. And I think largely because they don't understand it. They, even the people who are supposed to be the smart people working on it, they don't really understand. Yeah, they really don't understand how dire a situation we're in. And we are, you folks, we are.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who works in green energy. This is quite a while, 10 years ago, probably. And I asked him, in fact, it was when the first like 2012 IPCC thing came out that was like, head on fire, things are terrible. We got to do something now. And I said, are they exaggerating to like get people to act? And he was like, oh no, they're toning it down. Like it's much worse than they're saying. It's bad. But my other response to both you and Jordan is like, I really push all the time for the idea that we can't just lobby the people that are there. We have to replace people, because these people, like, you might be able to lobby them to reluctantly vote a certain way to pass a law on one particular day. But then for the next 300 days that they have to like implement that policy, they're not going to do it. Why? They don't agree with it. They don't want it. Right. So we have to elect new people. And I'm kind of a thorn in people's side because of that. But let's go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say it's so true. And it reminds me of how with many bills, because of the top-down nature of the House, you can end up getting a number of legislators who probably have secretly opposed the bill every step of the way, finally vote for it. And so you get a broad base of support in the end. But that doesn't mean that they actually really want the bill itself. They've just reluctantly just like agreed to pass it. And that, as you noted so well, can make implementation difficult if they don't even care that much about it being implemented. Yeah. Like the DOC is also one of the worst at actually implementing laws, where it's been in flagrant disregard.
DOC, Department of Corrections?
Department of Corrections, yes. In flagrant disregard of kind of criminal legal reform that the legislature has passed. And with them, the legislature just not ultimately doing that much to hold them accountable for it.
And I'd say the early signs from the Governor Healey's administration are that she is, unlike this is a place where she is breaking with Baker and going to take climate change more seriously. But I think that's more reason people need to engage with it, and we need people to say climate is important to them in front of her, to her people, and support the good people, because she's hired good people. She's put in, they've gotten good people in place. We need to make sure that they are hearing positives, and not just because mostly when you're in those regulatory places, when you're in those bodies, who you hear from every day: the fossil fuel industry, the car industry, people who have professional lobbyists, and they also need to hear from you.
You don't just hear from them, right? They have beautiful 40-page reports.
Oh, yes.
With these gorgeous graphs and photos.
We can get there if we slow down, it'll be fine. Yep, you're 100% right. Yeah. And so I think it's important that they hear from, the good people, feel supported to go as far as they themselves know that they should go.
Yeah. Okay, we are going to move on to elections. We got some exciting election news. The first is less exciting, I think. I just want to talk for a minute about what happened in Finland. So this week there were elections in Finland, and it isn't like it's not that. So I'll give you the thing before I go on into the details. The very, very popular left of center prime minister. She, oh my gosh, and now I don't have her name in front of me.
Sanna Marin?
Thank you. Sanna Marin, exactly. She has been voted out. A new conservative prime minister has been voted in. That's Petteri Orpo. And that it's not because they were voted in and out themselves. It's that they have a multi-party system. And so what happened was, even though the left of center party did increase the number of seats that they had in parliament, they didn't increase by nearly as much as the conservative party, right? A bunch of smaller parties lost seats. And so overall, the number of basically the party with the most seats gets to choose a prime minister. And so the conservative party now has more seats than the more left of center party. And so now they get to choose a prime minister, that's just the way it works there. And so there's a different prime minister there. And, in an analysis of why this happened, one of the primary reasons really is immigration, that, there are a lot of refugees in Europe in general, right? And people, when there are tons of refugees, people tend to vote more conservatively. They tend to vote more nationalist. They tend to vote for anti-immigrant policies. The before we go on and have more commentary, I have to say my basic analysis, just to bring in like climate change, immigration, elections, democracy. I firmly believe that when climate change gets worse than it is now, we are going to have not 1 million refugees from Syria or Yemen or any of these places. We are going to be having 20 million refugees. We're going to be having 50 million refugees. We're going to have 100 million refugees. And if you think that anti-immigrant policies and elections are bad now, I mean, it is going to be terrible. We are going to have wave upon wave of anti-immigrant, nationalist, conservative parties that take over country after country after country. And we have to rein in climate change. We have to take this seriously if we believe in democracy, if we believe in human rights. So this is one of my sort of overarching beliefs that I feel like needs to be said when there's something like this that happens. I mean, this election, did not have to go to the Conservative Party. But it's happening in country after country. And I really want to just tie immigration, democracy, and climate change all together.
Yeah, unfortunately.
I will come in speaking of elections. So we were talking before that there were a few big elections that happened earlier this week that have gotten a lot of attention. And the thing I was very happy to see Brandon Johnson, Cook County Commissioner, win in Chicago. Reclaiming the slogan of "Let's go Brandon" for the left. I'm here tongue in cheek there, which was exciting to see because of him having strong backing from the Working Families Party and from the Chicago Teachers Union, as well as progressives in Chicago against Paul Vallis, who in many ways was a crypto-Republican running on charter schools and cops, having largely destroyed and privatized a number of cities' public education systems, including Philadelphia, New Orleans, among others.
Great track record.
Right? And the fact that it was even that he had so much backing speaks so poorly of a lot of the Chicago and Illinois political elite.
And media.
Exactly. And the media point that I wanted to make in particular is that you saw in so much of the way that that race was covered in Chicago was about crime narrative. Everything was about how voters' number one issue is crime, and they want somebody who's going to be quote unquote tough on crime, and that led to the media often downplaying the extremely conservative record that Paul Vallis has. Such that if you look at his record, it is not that of a quote unquote moderate Democrat. It is much more in line with something that one would think of a Republican, which he himself has identified in the past. And what's striking is when you do have cases of this where people who win elections talking about needing to do bigger things and to think about our public safety from a more holistic standpoint, especially about investing in communities and having not just police as the people who need to respond to crimes. The media doesn't latch on to that about, voters want this, in the way that, let's say, when Eric Adams won the mayoral election in New York back in 2021, that immediately became a national referendum on crime to the media, in the same way in which the recall election in San Francisco against Chesa Boudin became a national referendum. But none of those same reporters wanted to say, when Michelle Wu beat Anissa Sabi George, that the candidate being backed by the police and being much more of a kind of a pro-police narrative lost, or in this election where that happened again, they don't get that same media treatment, which is something that's always it's always important from a media literacy perspective to be able to think about, with any story being told, somebody wants the story to be told and wants it to be told that way, which I feel this is kind of a great illustration of, that the fact that the outcome did not happen, that if you were reading the Chicago Tribune or a lot of other coverage, you would probably think that Paul Vallis would win by a comfortable margin. But that isn't what happened, which speaks to a really strong disconnect there. And which is also enlightening for how often that happens really around the country, with the way that media priorities reflect a largely rich and largely white kind of ownership or editorial board that is not necessarily reflective of a general metro area or city.
Yeah, I want to follow up with that and just talk, read some of the headlines. AP February, AP News, which if you don't know is very right of center, but somehow doesn't get that label. Chicago's mayor's race dominated by concerns about city crime. Just to give you an idea, like how much they just, Bloomberg in Chicago, high crime leads to mayor's downfall, right? So in the minds of the people, the thing that was most animating to voters was crime. And yet the person who is perceived as not good on crime, although obviously we know that the actual causes of crime are the fact that they are defunding schools, getting rid of hope, making it impossible to live there, too expensive, right? Like the causes of these things, but whatever. Obviously this is a dumb narrative. But I think it reflects both the laziness of it, the real racism embedded in a lot of these journalistic institutions, and also just how detached they are from regular people. Because actually, it turned out the animating factors in the election were based on were education and abortion, because Velis is not pro-choice and would have moved backwards on that issue in a time where that's perilous. So, what was animating to voters wasn't what dominated the coverage or what the people who own the media wanted you, right, when they're picking their stories, wanted you to believe was most important. And so I just think that's a good reminder. It's not that I don't think crime matters at all to voters, but I think it factored in a lot of different ways. And ultimately voters made a decision about voting for the less conservative person, right? And that's true in a lot of races. Even in New York, right? Like if you put together all the leftist candidates, they win. They just got split. So I think they create a narrative for themselves, and then they self-fulfill it. And then when news doesn't fit into it, they don't do any self-reflection that their own narratives are wrong.
Totally.
And so let's just to put it off, let's talk about the other big win on the night, which is Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Which is again another issue, another place where abortion and the importance of reproductive equity led out in the election, right, and switched a lot of voters to a 50-50 state into a ridiculously comfortable win. For, I will say, an accomplished person. We get into these fights and we talk about them a lot, but ultimately, I think it's important to note that like the person who the judge who won is actually accomplished, and the person she was running against is not. Like one of them has spent a lifetime on both sides trying to reduce crime, but also work on remediation, has worked with victims, has worked with people who perpetuate crime, has a real holistic view of these issues in the trenches, working with these people. Might not always agree, but I at least respect putting in time and work on those issues, right? Firsthand. Has a history of real accomplishments, of doing real things. And the sort of conservative in the race was somebody who like believed Trump should have won. Like that was the qualifications for running for office. And the media treats them as equal. They just like talk about it like it's equal. They talk about it like, oh, one side has this person who has done everything that's relevant to the job and has real beliefs, and the other one thinks Donald Trump won the election. I mean, both sides, right? Like it's just, it's bonkers.
I love the both sidesism. I really,
it's just fantastic. And so ultimately, Wisconsin voters in a very large majority did not take both sides to that. But I think it also reflects the really good work that's going on. I know some of the folks on the ground in Wisconsin. I've gotten to work with them a little through the shared state national spaces where people work on states, shared national space. And what I saw is somebody who was really interested in not just thinking about turning out the base, but also having on our values, tough conversations in conservative places. Conversations which in the 90s and the 2000s we were not supposed to have, about abortion, about LGBTQ rights, about crime, about things that we care about. And so part of the win isn't just that they ran up the score in Milwaukee, right? Which is what Democratic, historic, like what you do is you just run up the score in the Democratic places. They also competed in conservative spaces where they went from 30% to 40%. right? And those were wins, even as, right, the Fetterman approach, this idea that we need to have conversations on our values, but in ways people can hear, on the ground, door to door, in some of the places where it seems impossible. Because every little bit matters. Every little bit sort of pushes in the right direction. It also reflects some of the other things we're seeing, which is that more college-educated people are moving and poor folks. There are some warning signs. I would love for us to have a better conversation about how we're talking to low and middle income folks who work every day and why they would vote for people who literally hate them and want to make them serfs. But I think there's some things, but overall, I mean, that's a huge victory and something that progressives should be proud of. Progressives should be proud of what happened on Tuesday. We should be proud of the good, not just because we won, but because of how we won, which was just really hard work talking about our issues on the ground with people who don't see themselves as progressives. They see themselves as moderates, who see themselves as sort of maybe Democrats, but they voted for our ideas because we talked to them. And our ideas are better than our opponents who have no ideas. But even people who do have ideas, Paul Vellis has ideas. They're bad ideas, but they have ideas, right? He has ideas on how we can, appealing ideas on how we can move forward education, on how we can move forward on crime and other things. They're not good ideas, but they are valid, thoughtful ideas, right? On how to get forward. And we won the battle of ideas, right? People understood that actually, no, privatizing education isn't going to make education better. Simply just throwing cops at the problem isn't going to simply do it. We don't need a nuanced approach on reproductive freedom. We need people who understand that it's up to the people deciding for themselves what they do with their reproductive rights, right? Like our values won out, and they won out because of the hard work on the ground and the really amazing, incredible activists, organizers, people who were out there. And that's something we should be really proud of for Tuesday.
Right on. I want to thank everybody for being here. That is our news analysis for this week. And please do forward this show to your friends, forward this show to your activist people that you hang out with and do activist things with. Forward it to your mom, to your dad. We always can use donations to this show to make sure that the graphics keep going, that the editing keeps going, that our social media, we have an incredibly creative and wonderful, hardworking social media person who does all these super amazing graphics and everything else as well. And we want to make sure that we can continue doing those things to grow our audience and bring more people in. So thanks everybody, and we look forward to chatting with you all next week.
Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.